Я ухожу.
И в сортире их замочим, в конце концов.
Свобода лучше, чем не свобода.
Крым и Севастополь возвращаются в родную гавань.
Welcome to Infocom. In the new episode of Focus on Russia, our guest is Domenico Valenza, who is a researcher at Ghent University and UN University. Domenico, welcome.
Thank you, Tigran.
So your area of expertise is cultural diplomacy and public diplomacy, and particularly Russia's cultural diplomacy. So could you please explain to our viewers what is the concept of cultural diplomacy and what is the difference between the concept of cultural diplomacy and, say, soft power concept?
Thank you for your question. I would perhaps here refer first to the concept of public diplomacy, which is a close concept, which can be referred as any, government-sponsored attempt to engage with foreign audiences. This is quite a new, let's say, concept compared to that of traditional diplomacy, where the focus is on state-to-state relations. So the focus is on diplomatic agents. That's public diplomacy. Of course, when we talk about public diplomacy, all these concepts are closely related. One is, for instance, soft power, which is a concept that emerged in the 90s. It's a more recent concept compared to public diplomacy. And that of cultural diplomacy, where the focus is on using culture, somehow instrumentalizing culture in support of foreign policy objectives. So I would say these three concepts belong to the same area. Then, of course, when we talk about soft power, I would say this is broader in scope because it goes to focus on other aspects that are not, for instance, particularly public diplomacy ones.
Yeah, perfect. And coming to Russia, we would like to know how has Russia's public and cultural diplomacy evolved in the post-Soviet period?
Thank you. I would perhaps distinguish here three phases, in post-Soviet Russia. You have one first phase, which is straight after the collapse of the Soviet Union, in which Russia's public and cultural diplomacy are, I would say, relatively silent, particularly in the former Soviet region, but not only in the former Soviet region. And this is a phase that lasts, I would say, until the mid-2000s, when we have two important events, the so-called color revolutions. And it is at that moment that Russia enters this, let's say, second phase, new phase, in which there is a realization that if you want to engage with foreign public, only engaging with in state relations, so with elite, is not enough. You also need the broader public. And here, the solution that is provided at that moment is an institutional one. So we do not have the institution, we build institutions. For instance, at the international level, the first attempt within the framework of the Commonwealth of Independent States is to develop the so-called Interstate Fund for Scientific, Educational and Cultural Cooperation, IFESCO, in 2005. At the national level, you have the restructuring of Russia aid main structure, called today Rossotrunictvo, the creation of the network of Russian Center of Science and Culture, which today is in a different name and format. And you also have those organizations that are so-called gongos, for instance. This is a widely contested term, of course. And you have, for instance, Ruski Mir, just to give an example, the Russian World Foundation. This second phase lasts, I would say, until 2012, when we have the third and I would say, for now, last step in which, okay, now we have the institution, but we also need a new discourse. What do we do with this cultural diplomacy? And it is at that moment that cultural diplomacy becomes somehow involves an identity building objective. Of course, within Russia, because I would say that this switch is also connected to the broader conservative turn that we have seen in Russia since 2012. And it is at that moment that the discourse on culture becomes increasingly confrontational vis-à-vis the West, for instance. And it is at that moment that the passage from the silent to the active Russia is completed. In the post-Soviet space, for instance, this involves several aspects of their activities on which perhaps we can come back later.
Yeah. So you mentioned the year 2012. You describe in one of your latest papers why this year is important, why it is a key point in Russia's modern history. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Yes, I would say that it is at this moment, I mean, my focus is on culture, but I also see the broader picture of what took place in 2011, particularly the winter of protest. These were the biggest protests since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it is at this moment the culture becomes a clear tool to shape identity. I have in mind a quote from the former Minister of Culture of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Medinsky, saying that those who do not feed their own culture will feed someone else's army. And I often quote this sentence because I find it quite indicative. What do we have from the cultural level? We have, in 2014, the approval of the Fundamentals of State Cultural Policy, which is a document stating and representing Russia in civilizational terms. This is again a process that starts even before 2012 and becomes completed, let's say, in 2014. 2014 is also the year of Russian culture. And so you have also all these steps that led, in the end, culture to be weaponized, if I can say so, as a tool of foreign policy.
So can we conclude that starting from 2012, culture has been instrumentalized for foreign policy purposes, but foreign policy as well has been instrumentalized to consolidate the regime's power inside the country?
Yes, exactly. I would say that the two things go together. I look at the puzzle between culture, foreign policy, and identity as a triangle, actually. The three intersect with them, and in the end, it's also through foreign policy that you can stabilize, let's say, your consensus inside and marginalize those who disagree with your policy trajectory.
So coming back to Russia's cultural diplomacy in the post-Soviet area, what are the most recurrent themes in the process of waging this diplomacy?
I would say what today perhaps is the most important one is definitely the role of history, how history is represented. And when I refer to history, I refer in particular to the Second World War, which is represented in Russia's public and cultural diplomacy as the Great Patriotic War. And this involves a number of steps from, this is one day, May 9, but it's also, let's say, an event that is used throughout the whole year. So it doesn't matter if it's January, February, March, it's always there. It's always a recurring topic. And this can take many different forms, from, for instance, the Besmiertny polk that takes place in the former Soviet region. This is a form of invented tradition, but you have also a certain symbolism. The example of lientochki, for instance, they are also widely used. Also, since, for instance, if I refer to the case of Moldova, it was, I don't remember if it was 2008 or 2009, that they were distributed for the first time by a company, Evrasiet, in Moldova. So you have the invention of a tradition, the invention of symbolism, and history is clearly the fundamental representative. But next to that, if we move more to the aesthetical component of cultural diplomacy, you also have the great Russian writer, the great Russian singers, and a certain attempt to distance this from what is contemporary art, which has a secondary value. Let's say in the idea of, at least of Russian government throughout from 2012 to 2018, let's say, Russian contemporary art is allowed to be there, but shouldn't be funded, shouldn't be supported by the government.
Yeah, so before coming to the question about the war in Ukraine, I would like to summarize this section of our interview with a question about the effectiveness of Russia's cultural diplomacy in a period, let's say, starting from mid-2000 until 2020. How effective has it been? For instance, in the case of Moldova or in the case of other post-Soviet states, has Russia managed to achieve its foreign policy goals through this form of diplomacy?
I would say that to a certain extent, I mean, let's say Russia was able to capitalize, was able to somehow, if I refer to the case of Moldova, was able to geo-weaponize societal mourning around a festivity. Victory Day, by the way, is also a Moldovan festivity, as contested as it is. And in a way, Russia was able to reappropriate, common memory, common event. So if we look from this perspective, I would say definitely yes, it was effective. At the same time, however, if we look at this from a diachronic perspective, we should be wary of coming to this conclusion because, of course, what was celebrated as Victory Day perhaps 10 years ago, in the case of Moldova, perhaps of other former Soviet countries, is not today. So I think it really depends on the national context and on the micro-analysis that then we are going to do.
One of my last questions is related to the war in Ukraine. How has Russia's cultural diplomacy changed since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine?
Thank you for the question. The war in Ukraine is mentioned in Russia's social media, is discussed. Sometimes there are cultural representatives that have discussed the war. I do not have a straightforward answer to this question. I think that on the one hand, war is a big challenge. So to a certain extent, we could argue the war is the end, of public and cultural diplomacy. But on the other side, and at the same time, and I saw this also in my fieldwork in Moldova, there are always attempts to, instrumentalize what is going on in Ukraine, to rewrite, to make a new narrative of what is going on in Ukraine, and represent Russia as the maker of peace in the former Soviet region. This is, of course, a blatantly contested point, but this is also what happens, for instance, among participants in Russia's public diplomacy events. So I think that to answer this question, we will need, more time ahead.
There is also the other trend, the counter-reaction to Russia's war in Ukraine, has resulted in re-evaluation of the Soviet past. We've seen in many cases how Soviet monuments are being relocated and things like that. So I think it's not a one-way process, right?
Yes, exactly. I think it really depends on how the context, for instance, as it's clear that if we look at Ukraine, the answer is pretty much evident. There is a war going on, and it's pretty much clear to Ukrainians what is going on in Ukraine. But if you move away from Ukraine and you go to another country, it's again all about the narratives, and it's less about facts that are represented, but it's about how narratives represent those facts. And based on that, you can have one reaction or you can have another one. So we are in what the High Representative of the European Union called battle of narratives.
Yeah, exactly. Domenico, thanks a lot for an interesting conversation.
Thank you.